Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, welcome. My name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I focus mostly on unsolved true crime and history, specifically dark history, and that's what I've got for you today. We've all heard the phrase breeding like rabbits before, meaning to breed rapidly, to have multiple children. But what if a woman actually gave birth to rabbits? Well, tales of such a story spread through England in the early 18th century, a woman called Mary Toft having apparently given birth to 17 rabbits, or parts of rabbits. There's an article in the Weekly Journal from Monday the 10th of October 1726, reading: "From Guildford comes a strange but well-attested piece of news, that a poor woman who lives at Godalming near that town, who has a husband and 2 children now living with her, was about a month past delivered by Mr. John Howard, an eminent surgeon and man midwife living at Guildford, of a creature resembling a rabbit." But before we get into the story, I just want to take a moment to talk about something that would probably blow poor Mary Toft's mind. Thank you to Proton VPN for sponsoring this video. Proton VPN is a high-speed VPN service trusted by over 100 million people around the world, ready to revolutionise the way that you browse online, allowing you to surf the web with no restrictions. With Proton VPN, you can say goodbye to invasive ads and malware with their ad-free and malware-free platform. NetShield, Proton's built-in ad blocker, shields you from malware, ads and intrusive website trackers, and you can safeguard your privacy with Proton's strict no user activity logs policy, meaning that your activity online remains completely confidential. Your IP address, activity and connection location are never tracked or shared with anyone. You can experience peace of mind with Proton VPN's kill switch and always on VPN features, so you don't ever need to worry about forgetting to connect. You can connect to over 2,800 servers from 68 different countries on all your devices, so you are covered wherever you go. And yes, that does mean you can access different streaming services from all around the world. You want to join me on watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine before bed every night, but it's not on Netflix in your country? Well, great news, because we have it over here in the UK. Just switch your server. All you have to do is go to the description box down below and download Proton today, and you can save 57%. Now, back to the video and Mary Toft birthing little rabbit babies. Mary Toft was a woman living in Godalming in Surrey with her husband Joshua and their children, and they were pretty poor. Godalming, with a population of 2,000 to 3,000 people, was a pretty large town at this time, but it was also a town of great poverty. It relied very heavily on the wool industry, and that was just in decline. Joshua Toft worked as an unskilled clothier in said wool industry, and Mary would simply just pick up local agricultural work as and when it came up. So it's safe to say that the family were definitely struggling. And on top of their monetary issues, the family had also been struggling with some personal issues as well. According to sources, one of their children, their firstborn daughter, died of smallpox when she was just 4 months old, around 1723. And then in August 1726, Mary suffered a miscarriage. She was working throughout the summer doing gruelling labour in the fields in the hot sun, and she lost the baby. She would later report passing an object as big as her arm and then experiencing a flooding that lasted a week, giving birth to something that, being so early on, barely resembled a human fetus. The after effects of this miscarriage would last over several weeks. Mary got quite ill with it, but reports state that she never actually stopped looking pregnant. And then, towards the end of September 1726, it was reported that Mary inexplicably went into labour, reportedly giving birth to something now that resembles a livered cat. It's reported that at this initial birth, she was attended by her neighbour Mary Gill and her mother-in-law Anne Toft. The family, not really knowing what to do, decide to call upon a doctor and a man midwife from nearby Guildford, John Howard. The next day, John Howard visits Mary, where he's presented with a number of animal parts that Mary had allegedly given birth to during the previous night. He then witnesses another birth himself, seeing with his own eyes rabbits coming out of Mary's vagina, and he believes that this delivery is genuine. I mean, how could it not be? He'd seen it. It's said that after witnessing 2 rabbit deliveries, Howard turns to books and to the church to try and make sense of what was happening. He prays. After 5 births, he's in awe, branding himself as the world's foremost expert in human leporine midwifing. Leporine meaning of or resembling a hare or hares. Over the next month, Howard assists Mary as she births a variety of things. 3 legs of a cat of a tabby colour and 1 leg of a rabbit. The guts were as a cat's, and in them were 3 pieces of the backbone of an eel. She also birthed 9 dead baby rabbits right in front of him, which he pickled in jars and left lined up on the shelf in his study. He sent letters to elite doctors in London sharing this miraculous story, but first nobody's really interested in hearing from this small-time man midwife from Guildford. But he also wrote to the secretary of King George I, and it said that the king was immediately intrigued, especially as by this point the story had been picked up by the media too, the Weekly Journal reporting on it first in the Monday the 10th of October 1726 article I read out at the beginning of this episode. The king sent 2 of his closest doctors to investigate, Nathaniel St. Andre and Cyriacus Arles. Now it's said that Nathaniel St. Andre was not a great person, nor was he a particularly great doctor, but he'd been hired as King George's personal physician because he was German, and King George had succeeded his great-aunt Queen Anne I after living in Germany for most of his life. He was German-speaking, he needed a German-speaking physician. St. Andre apparently found himself caught up in scandals fairly often. He loved a bit of drama, he loved media attention, so of course he was going to love a story like Mary Toft's. Arles, on the other hand, was the official royal doctor of the German royal family. He didn't really have as much of a reputation as St. Andre, and he went into this whole thing with much more scepticism, so you'd like to think they balanced each other out. By this point, Mary had become somewhat of a small-time celebrity around Godalming, so she had been moved to Guildford to be closer to Howard, and by the time St. Andre and Arles arrived, she was still giving birth to rabbits. On November 15th, when they finally turn up, they're greeted with the news that Mary's in labour yet again with her 15th rabbit, and again she gives birth in front of them. The doctors examine the baby, and conduct examinations, which cause them to determine that despite witnessing the births, the rabbits couldn't have originated in Mary's body. I mean, one of their stomachs even contained remnants of hay and grass they had eaten, clearly not inside Mary. Some were also fetuses, whilst others were older, but all rabbits were born dead. All they really had to go on at this point was the rabbits though. This was the 18th century, they didn't have modern medicine or modern technology. They couldn't exactly scan Mary and look inside her until she was dead. Now St. Andre, despite this, was fascinated by it all. He loved the story, so he started explaining away all these things. He came up with reasons as to how this could all be legitimate. But Arles was much more sceptical. He noted how Mary would move, keeping her legs tightly closed as if she was holding something inside, until she had to perform a birth. It just became this ego-bashing contest between the men, with all of them being very worried that if this is found out to be a hoax, they're going to be embarrassed. I mean, even Arles, who didn't believe it, eventually started making excuses. There was very little care or focus from these medical men on poor Mary, because clearly something was going on here. I don't need to tell you that this was a hoax. Mary wasn't really giving birth to rabbits. That's not possible. In an attempt to sort this out once and for all, the king sent down a 3rd doctor to try and figure out what the hell was going on. Sir Richard Manningham was the best of the best. He was the most elite. He was a fellow of the Royal Society and a member of the College of Royal Physicians. He was the doctor and midwife among upper-class society in London. When he arrived in Guildford, he helped Mary deliver what he thought at the time was a hog's bladder, although there was bickering between the men as to what it was. But he was very suspicious because apparently whatever this thing was did smell of urine. But he also got pulled in. He wanted to make excuses as to the validity of this situation. He didn't want to believe it was a hoax either. It was decided that Mary needed to move to London so she could be closer to the king's quarters and they could all keep an eye on the situation. On November 29th, 1726, Manningham assisted her to a lodgings in Leicester Fields in London, which is Leicester Square today. When she arrived there, it looked as if the deliveries were going to continue. Manningham noted that one side of her stomach was swollen and appeared to move. She was in pain, but once she moved to London, she never delivered a rabbit again. Richard Manningham wrote at the time, "The motions were various, sometimes with very strong throws across the belly, especially on the right side. At other times with sudden jerks and rising and tremulous motions and pantings, like the strong pulsations of the heart. And as I sat on the bed in company with 5 or 6 women, it would sometimes shake us all very strongly. The whole appeared to me very different from any convulsive or hysteric motion I have ever met with before." Now, by the point that Mary had been moved to London, they'd already been working on a theory for several weeks. The Weekly Journal printed on Monday the 10th of October 1726. "The woman hath made oath that 2 months ago, being working in a field with other women, they put up a rabbit, who running from them, they pursued it, but to no purpose. This created in her such a longing to it that she, being with child, was taken ill and miscarried, and from that time she hath not been able to avoid thinking of rabbits. The said woman has been delivered of 5 more rabbits, in all 14. In modern English, the story goes that 2 months beforehand, so just before her miscarriage in August, Mary had been working in a field with a bunch of other women when they saw a rabbit. They chased after the rabbit, but they couldn't catch it, and this created such a longing in Mary for this rabbit that she got ill and ended up miscarrying. From that moment on, she wasn't able to stop thinking about the rabbits until she ended up giving birth to one." At this time, maternal impression or maternal imagination was one of the leading medical theories when it came to pregnancy, explaining away the existence of birth defects and congenital disorders. It put the blame on the women. It was thought that emotional stimulus imagination experienced by a pregnant woman could influence the development of her fetus, and this could lead to monstrous births. And I know that isn't the language we would use nowadays, but the word monstrous here referred to any infant born with physical anomalies. A woman birthing rabbits certainly would come under that umbrella of monstrous, but so would so many other things. It sounds awful now, I know, but as I always say, history sucks. Monstrous births and maternal impression had long been theorised, and would long continue to be theorised after this point. I mean, it was widely considered that Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man's still mysterious condition, was the result of maternal impression, as his mother was nearly trampled by an escaped elephant, and then that is what he came to be known as. But in 1726, Mary became the first case of a woman having a monstrous birth, an obvious monstrous birth, right in front of their eyes. The first-hand accounts to ever be reported on in the media. And this did trigger a huge debate across medical men in the country about whether maternal imagination was truly a thing or not. At this time in the early 18th century, medical knowledge was slowly moving away from the classical theories like maternal imagination and more towards tangible knowledge obtained through observation and experimentation. They weren't quite there yet, but all of this movement towards solid medical knowledge is essentially the base of what we have today. And our medical knowledge tells us that this simply isn't possible. Mary Toft was not giving birth to rabbits. We know it was a hoax, but it took the doctors here a while to fully realise what was going on. Whilst Mary was in London, as I said, she did go into labour several times, but she never actually gave birth. And then in early December 1726, a porter in the Leicester Fields house was overheard saying that he'd been asked to smuggle in rabbits through the back door. It suddenly clicked and the jig was up. Mary was immediately questioned by the doctors. Sir Manningham threatened her with some kind of experiment if she didn't confess that this had all been a hoax. We don't know exactly what kind of experiments were talked about here, but we can assume that they would have been very invasive, the kind of experiment to check whether or not Mary had indeed been giving birth to rabbits. Whatever Manningham alluded to, Mary was scared and she ended up confessing. On the 5th of December 1726, Mary was taken into custody for the crime of imposture, and over the coming days, proceedings would come in front of 2 courts, the Westminster Sessions and the Court of Kings, where she was charged with abominable frauds and imposture. John Howard, the first doctor who tended to her, was also accused of conspiring with Mary to pull off this hoax. Mary was interrogated at length, and on the 7th of December 1726, she makes a statement written down by James Douglas, a doctor who was present when she was questioned. Amazingly, these statements survive today. The opening line is, "I will not go on any longer, thus I shall sooner hang myself. I was delivered of a true monstrous birth." Still, she's giving them what she thinks they want to hear, a monstrous birth. Now, we don't know who exactly started the prosecution against Mary because the names are inexplicably missing from surviving documents, but it does certainly seem like the full power of the King's government was behind this case. They really didn't want her to get off scot-free. I mean, this was embarrassing to all of the doctors involved and to the King personally. He'd sent his best doctors and they'd been taken in, they believed it. The media were talking all about it, and once this was found out to be a hoax, they were making fun of all the doctors involved. Not just Mary was mocked, but the doctors too. Elite men had been fleeced, it was just an embarrassment. Mary was sent to Bridewell Prison in Westminster, which is where the only known portrait of her was drawn. Now, the artist did use a bit of artistic license to add a rabbit into her lap. No doubt that wasn't actually there, but this was now her legacy. For the next 4 months, Mary was subject to hard labour, which caused her to become incredibly ill, but she was ultimately released without charge. You see, they were struggling to find a crime to actually charge Mary with because nothing she'd done was technically illegal. I mean, it wasn't fraud, there had been no financial loss to anyone, it wasn't a crime of imposture, which is pretending to be someone else in order to deceive others. There was no crime of pretending to give birth to rabbits in the law books. As much as they wanted to, they couldn't legally keep Mary in prison just because she embarrassed them. Although saying that, this was the early 18th century and the King would have been involved here, so I'm sure if they wanted to keep her in prison, they might have been able to find some way to do it, but either way, she was released. In 1727, Mary left prison and went back to obscurity. The whole tale of Mary Toft and her rabbit babies, a small 3-month blip in 1726. But I suppose the big question here is why? Why did Mary conduct this hoax in the first place? Was Mary even the one pulling the strings here? Of course, I have some social context for you. Godalming, as I said earlier, was a town in great distress at this time. With the decline of the wool industry, the town was suffering with poverty like never before, and that meant that the gap between the rich and the poor was larger than ever. The rich were completely unaffected by what was going on, they weren't relying on the industry at all. The poor were now completely penniless, they were jobless. And so there were massive protests going on in Surrey, and part of the protest included the poor poaching animals off the rich's land, with Mary's husband Joshua having recently been involved in a large-scale protest at a wealthy landowner's fish pond. A big part of Mary and Joshua's life at this time would have been focused around this poaching, around this protest. Another example of this protest poaching was rabbits, who weren't pets at this time but were considered to be private property. They were kept on fenced areas on the land of the rich. Stealing private property at this time was a capital crime. It was punishable by death. Rabbits were for sport hunting for the wealthy, not for the poor to eat. For the poor they were a rare commodity, a symbol of the elite and the wealthy. And then here is poor, poverty-stricken Mary Toft, who months before was chasing rabbits precisely because she was poor and couldn't afford one, now giving birth to them. This would have been a very strong political statement at this time. Although too many centuries have now passed to know exactly the motivations and the conversations behind this, it has been long suggested that this wasn't a mentally ill woman shoving rabbits up her vagina for the fun of it. Mary may have been little more than a pawn in a much wider game here. Some people suggest that her in-laws put her up to this in order to draw attention to their plight. Mary was a young, extremely poor, probably impressionable woman who got in over her head. She probably didn't expect to be transported to London, to have the eyes and ears of the King on her every movement, the eyes of the entire medical profession. In her confessions, Mary pointed the finger at many different people, her husband, her mother-in-law, randoms from her town. but it doesn't seem like anyone ever settled on a true story here. But what we do know is it seems that Mary never had any power at all. If the story of Mary Toft managed to do one thing, it was to draw attention to the incompetence of the medical men of the day, how fame hungry a lot of them were, and that's what they were in the profession for the next medical marvel, to gain fame from it, to be in the papers, not to genuinely help. This became humiliating for the whole medical profession. There's a cartoon by satirist William Hogarth called The Wise Men of Godlyman in Consultation, or more notably, Cunilari, which is a play on the Latin cuniculus for rabbit and cunus for vulva. It shows Mary surrounded by her husband and doctors, them queuing out the door to tend to her, not caring about Mary per se, but wanting notoriety of the case. Mary's in a very vulnerable position, a doctor with his hand under her skirt. This doctor is captioned as an occult philosopher searching into the depths of things. It seems to me that whilst immediately after this all came to light, Mary was very much vilified in the media, it eventually became very clear that she was taken advantage of, and cartoonists, satirists such as this one, very much could see that was going on. Mary was not in a position of power here. In 1726, there was a 12-stanza illustrated poem released about the scandal, with the first stanza reading: "Poor Mary Toft in ignorance was bred, and ne'er betrayed a deep designing head. Ne'er seemed cut out for plots, yet never did rife, like her impose so grossly on man midwife. With scorning reason, common sense and nature, placed all their faith in such a stupid creature." And there's the story of Mary Toft, the woman who didn't give birth to rabbits. Thank you so much for watching today. Before you click off this video, make sure you interact in some way. Give it a like, leave a comment, just any sort of interaction helps push my videos out into the YouTube algorithm, which I really, really need right now. Thank you to Proton VPN for sponsoring this video. Please make sure to check them out in the description box, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.